Proverbs 3, verses 9 to 10. Honor the Lord with thy substance and with the first fruits of all thy increase. So shall thy barns be filled with plenty. Now watch this. And thy presses shall burst out with new wine. Now obviously, as those wine presses were being squeezed of the grapes in them, and they were bursting out with new wine. So let's be honest here. Are we to just automatically believe that what was coming out of those wine presses called new wine was an alcoholic beverage? Absolutely not. It's just simple grape juice. That's all it was. And yet you find this in Genesis chapter 40, verse 11, when Joseph is giving the interpretation of a dream that the cupbearers have, and the cupbearers basically tell him the portion of the dream, and it says, and Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I gave the cup unto Pharaoh's hand. So, in other words, what was Pharaoh drinking there was little more than just squeezed grapes, and it's just fresh grape juice, which obviously is what we would call today, in modern sense of the word, just grape drink. Yet in the Bible terminology, the word wine is used, and so sometimes it causes a misunderstanding because people immediately associate the word wine with alcohol. Now, would you think that anybody looking at this cluster of grapes that you see right now, would you mistaken this for alcohol? And yet the scripture calls this cluster of grapes hanging on the vine wine. It literally refers to this as being wine, even though it's still in the form of a grape. Inside, obviously, is the juice that you have to squeeze out. And yet, here's what it says in Isaiah 65, verse 8. Thus saith the Lord, as the new wine is found in the cluster, and one saith, destroyeth not, for a blessing is in it. Now, isn't it interesting? Even the Lord refers to this as wine, even though it's still in the cluster hanging on the vine. Now, why am I going through all this? Well, because I don't think too many people today really understand the importance of maybe associating these passages with their proper place. For example, immediately, if somebody says, do you believe in drinking wine? Most people immediately think of an association with alcohol. And yet, scripturally, they'll say, well, the Bible talks about drinking wine. So therefore, conclusions are made. Since I think wine today means alcohol, then wine must be alcohol in the scripture. Well, you can go down to a typical grocery store and find non-alcoholic wine all the time. But you know what I thought was interesting is Dr. Thomas Welch, who was a physician and a dentist by trade, was one of the first ones to pasteurize Concord grape juice. And he did this to produce a communion juice for his church. And obviously it was the beginning of the processed food juice industry, which is very famous today. And there's obviously many of you that have drank Welch's grape juice. It's fantastic. And it's very healthy and full of all kinds of tremendous blessings in it, just as the scripture referred to. And the greater majority of places that I have gone in churches that have communion services will use Welch's grape juice. And really, it's very important because it's based on a biblical fact that even the Lord and his disciples during that communion, which we do this, the Lord's Supper, actually used non-fermented fruit of the vine. And I'll prove this in just a few minutes. But the reason why I'm sharing this with you is because even the Lord himself, in using a parable in Mark chapter 2, refers to wine, but I want you to notice that in this whole verse, several times you're going to hear the word wine, but it's very obvious, unfermented, by the very fact of what the illustration is referring to. Let's read this passage closely. And no man putteth new wine into old bottles or wineskins, else the new wine doth burst the bottles. Now, obviously, they didn't have glass bottles. There he's referring to what is commonly known as wineskins, where they take skins of animals and they would put the squeezed juice into these skins, and obviously, as a result of fermentation, it would begin to expand the skins. And in this case, Jesus said you wouldn't put new wine, which is unfermented, into wineskins that's already been stretched. Otherwise, once they're stretched out to the maximum amount, then as this continues to ferment, it would burst these wineskins. Let's read it again. It says, "And no man putteth new wine into old bottles, else the new wine doth burst the bottles, and the wine is spilled, and the bottles will be marred. But new wine is put into new bottles." Now, in every single one of those references, the Lord is referring to wine, and yet every one of them is referring to being unfermented. It's not gone through the process of fermentation, which would expand and burst. Now, isn't it interesting that when you're reading the scripture and you read the word wine, that you would come to a conclusion that we're referring to alcohol, but in reality, we're not. The scripture uses the word wine to both define unfermented and fermented juice of grapes. Now, with that in mind, let me just share with you some other examples. Sometimes the same word, we do this today all the time. So it's not a big issue for us. We can understand stuff. For example, I've heard people say, "Wow, that church is on fire." And then somebody will say, "That church is on fire." Well, even though you're using the exact same phrases, exact same words, in the exact same sentence structure, the word fire, in one sense the word could be something good, whereas fire in the other sense could be something horrible. I mean, technically, you'd like to see your church on fire and being aggressively going after God and really, have a real burning zeal for the things of the Lord. But obviously, you wouldn't want your church to be burning in the sense that it's physically going to be destroyed. But we use the same phrase, the church is on fire. Give another example. This one's a little humorous. The other day, we were watching some old Flintstone DVDs in our family, and we have a little machine that's got what's called a TV Guardian on it. And this TV Guardian will allow profanity to be taken out of the DVD. And it's kind of a neat thing. But it was funny because we were all laughed because part of the song that's played at the beginning of each episode of the Flintstones is the phrase, "We'll have a gay old time." Well, TV Guardian is set up so it will take out references to stuff such as gay or whatever, because today the word gay has connotations that are totally referring to homosexuality. Now, when I was growing up in the 60s, when the Flintstones were out, that song, no one associated the word gay with homosexuality. Back then, it was just referring to having a fun time, a good old time. Well, today, gay has no reference in people's mind to having fun or good. It's actually in references to homosexuality, which that's a whole nother topic in and of itself. And yet everyone knows that this is true. We do this all the time. The word wine is literally an issue that has to do with meanings, two different things. Obviously, every time you read the word wine in the Bible, it is not referring to alcohol. So you hear Jesus drank wine. Well, if that's the case, then you'd say, well, it's okay for me to drink, which leads to hundreds of other issues and we'll deal with in just a moment. But sometimes the word wine simply refers to juice coming from a grape. And it's absolutely just referring to basically Welch's grape juice.